Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here this morning. I really feel like I'm among my she just came untied, so if I fall, please don't laugh. But please, somebody videotape it so I can go viral. You can't have too many followers on Twitter. It really is. For me, this is like a homecoming because in 1989, I started as a correctional officer in a little county jail in Lebanon County in the middle of, actually the county that Hershey, Pennsylvania is. And I walked through as a young and optimistic CO, eventually worked my way up through the ladder. And I remember in 2011, when I was appointed to this job, I was literally running a 300-bed county jail. And the next day took over a 51,000 and a half inmate system, 27 prisons, 15, 16, 17,000 employees. And I'm gonna let you know a little secret. So, of course, when I got the job, what did everybody say? Oh, the job's over his head. I remember in going through the confirmation process, one of my first meetings was with a senator who had one of our biggest prisons in her district. And I remember, and she was a tough little lady. I remember sitting down and she said, I'm just gonna tell you, I think the job's over your head. And my response without hesitation was, I'm just gonna tell you, I think you're full of crap. And she paused for a second, but let's be honest. If you can't get through one meeting with one senator, you got no business running this system. And I said, the consistent thing I've heard about this system from everybody I talked about is no one is happy with where it is. So what's business as usual got you? And the reality is it got them nothing except a bunch of people locked up, especially a bunch of poor people and black and brown people. And it didn't get them any safer, but it got you a lot poorer. And that's really the context that we came in. And I came in under an ultra-conservative former Attorney General, Tom Corbett, who would not be mistaken for a progressive big thinker, all right? But I gotta tell you, he came in with a cohesion of vision about what we wanted out of our criminal justice system. And 6 years later, I stand here with 3,000 less inmates, with about half the percentage in restrictive housing. That 3,000 inmate reduction is 101% non-white. So we've made progress. But I'll tell you the secret. The secret is this job is a hell of a lot easier than running that little 300-bed county jail. And I don't say that to pander, but obviously I've made it through ultra-conservative Republican and a super progressive Democrat, so I do have the pandering gene. I have the ability to do that. But I gotta tell you that the rubber meets the road right here where you are. And I remember running that county jail. I remember doing my own press releases. I remember the number of commitments. I remember every policy decision being questioned at the grocery store. And I remember how difficult it was and how fast everything moved. And it's really akin when you compare a state prison system to a county jail system. It's really like an emergency room versus a nursing home, right? But it's not just a regular emergency room. It's an emergency room that's under-resourced, understaffed, and highly scrutinized. And this is what we all signed up for. Like, what were we thinking? So when I heard of this initiative and the fact that so many people had the guts and the courage to step up and say, no, business as usual is not good enough. It's just quite an honor for me to be here and to be able to spend just a couple minutes with you and function, and I apologize for the image in advance, but as a cheerleader for the work you're doing. I know you don't need that image in your head, neither do I, frankly. But I really just want to laud the work you do and really encourage you to continue to go further. I really see this initiative, and I got to tell you, one of the cool things that's going on is at the state level, we have, I would say, more than 50% of the corrections directors in the country who are exactly where I'm at as far as understanding the system that we've built. And I hate to even call it a system, because a system implies that we made a series of coordinated, deliberate decisions to run something, and we've done none of that. As a matter of fact, we built this bloated system on a series of seemingly unrelated decisions, blind to outcomes, blind to the implications of those decisions. And I know people say that justice is supposed to be blind. We're not supposed to be blind to the implications of the decisions we make. But we have been. As a matter of fact, outcomes. What happens after someone's arrested? What's the impact on them? What's the impact on their families? What's the impact on the community by removing so many people who don't have to be removed to keep the community safe? We've ignored or didn't even look or didn't even think about, didn't even contextualize that we have a responsibility as policymakers, we have a responsibility as criminal justice professionals to own the outcomes of people who we touch. Now, government at its best, and yes, that's an oxymoron, admittedly, but government at its best, when it has to get involved in somebody's life, one would think, one would hope, one would pray that we would get together or get involved in that individual's life only to the extent that we need to and with the goal in mind. Now, it doesn't matter what room I sit in. The one thing we can agree on is that when somebody becomes criminally involved in the front end of the system, what we want is when they come out of the back end of the system, we want them to be less likely to become criminally involved again. But here's the magic in this, and here's what we've failed to do. To do that, we have to put the individual on a path to address whatever issues led to the crime itself, but as importantly, put them in the system that makes the most sense to solve the problem. And we've not done that. As a matter of fact, we've just decided that we're going to look through the criminal justice lens for pretty much all things. Certainly for addiction, we look at it through the criminal justice lens. Certainly, if you look at our numbers for individuals suffering from mental illness who are not receiving the behavioral health services that they need in the community, they come to us. Certainly, if you look at who's populating our systems, certainly you can't argue that people living in poverty are a heck of a lot more likely to come to us. Certainly, you can't make an argument that people of color are more likely to come to us, right? So we've used this system to default. And I got to tell you, that reform who starts at the back end of the system, is destined to fail. It's way too reactionary, way too far down the road. And to be honest, for some of our lowest risk individuals, we've already screwed them up by sending them to a state prison in the first place. So why this initiative? Why you, as somebody who really, I see this as a point in time in our history where we have a real opportunity. And I know that in November, things got a little weird down in DC and all that stuff. I get it. I hear all the rhetoric. But you know what? I don't buy any of that shit. I don't buy it. Because if we just go, oh, throw our hands up, oh, we can't do anything, we've lost already. Like, I don't know one person who's working in the system who really gets it, who's really honest, who really looks at the implications of our decisions, who looks at the implications of what we do. I mean, if you're bragging about a 40% recidivism rate, come on, man, lift the bar a little higher. I mean, seriously, if I had 2 tickets for Hawaii and said 6 out of 10 times you're gonna land, who's getting on that plane? No hands. For the record, no hands. So why is that okay? But again, the reality is, for us to have a good system, it has to start by a good decision at the front end. And to make a good decision at the front end, we have to understand who we're dealing with the first time we touch them. And again, you can't get in a room like this where you don't talk about addiction, you don't talk about mental illness, right? And let's be honest, any hole in any system, from the behavioral health system to the education system to workforce development system to economic opportunities, at the other end of that hole is a jail or a prison. But if we want to get out of the hole that we've built for ourselves, it requires strategic partnerships. And by starting this initiative and really focusing on data, like the fact that focusing on data, making data-driven decisions is groundbreaking in criminal justice explains why I'm in criminal justice, because I'm not splitting the atom, right? But when we came in and started talking about data and baseline and performance outcomes, man, we were in the New York Times and everything. Think about how low that bar is. Think about this for a second. Like if you make what we do akin to the medical field, we'd be putting a leech on you next time you got the flu. Or we'd be doing brain surgery for a headache. Like there's exemplars that we can use all over in all other systems. So for us to act and for us to allow people to define us by saying that the only way you achieve public safety is by locking people up, when the data says quite the opposite, then some of that is on us. I mean, why do we feel the need to defend what you're doing here? Why do we find the need to do what we're all calling reform, when reform is just inserting sanity in an insane system? The notion, like people say, oh, what's the Einstein quote, doing the same thing over and over again, getting a different result is the definition of insanity. That's not the Einstein quote that I try to build what we build off. The Einstein quote that I think is really relevant for this is that problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking at which they were created. We created these problems, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I've worked in government for a long time. I've not met one person who can keep a damn secret. So I really don't buy all the conspiracy stuff, but what I will tell you is that whatever the intentions were, whatever our response to crime was, we went over the top. And we just defaulted to this notion, to this presumption of incarceration. And there is a presumption of incarceration in our system, and that's not okay. That's inconsistent with what we purport to say are the values of our community and the values of our country, but that's where we're at. So I believe in many cases, the first step is flipping that assumption on its head. We need to make the assumption that jail is the last resort. But folks, we owe the individuals who come through our system a lot more than just saying we're not gonna lock you up. And I wish that most of this work was done from the folks in human services, and I wish it was done in education, especially early childhood education, and getting kids, especially in some of our more challenged communities, engaged in school and valuing learning and all that stuff. But the reality is where we're at today is we have a whole lot of people locked up. And we have an opportunity to lock less people up. And we have a responsibility to show the country that we can do that, and not only do that in a safe manner, but do that because it makes sense. It makes sense from a financial standpoint, it makes sense from a humanistic standpoint, and it makes sense because we get outcomes. And we get less disparate. You know, one of the coolest phenomenons that we've seen, and I know Connecticut's here, and I stole this from Mike Lawler, which is what I generally do whenever I can. But our population has been reduced by 3,000 over the past 5 years. And over 100% of that reduction is in our non-white population. Same thing has happened virtually around the country. And when you think about what our system is with the disparity, how we have disparate incarceration for people of color and poor people, of course, reforms are gonna reduce that. But beyond that, we have systems that get reforms and still get outcomes, meaning beyond recidivism, beyond everything else, but get outcomes of less crime. Less crime. That's what we say we're gonna do. And when we all know that when we put lower risk individuals in our system, even longer than 24 hours, they become more likely to commit a crime than us not telling that story, us not building systems to respond to that, us not taking steps to fundamentally change that. It's just a lack of courage. It's just a lack of courage. And I expect zero courage from our elected officials. I expect zero. Because long-term thinking, at least in my context, is the next election. So more than 50% of the people who make these decisions are focused on 2 years out. And if we focus our approach to 2 years out, we're not getting big thinking, right? We're not getting proactive policies that are gonna result in kids being less likely to be incarcerated 15 years from now, because that's cost avoidance 15 years from now. So that's why I say that more than anything, we need courage. And so when I'm sitting here having the opportunity to interact with you today, I'm so excited because I really see this effort no different than putting an astronaut on the moon or or Christopher Columbus, where everyone else believed the earth is flat, and I understand that that's like a new thing too, but let's just assume for the purpose of conversation the earth is not flat. But at the time, people thought that Christopher Columbus was literally gonna sail off the edge of the earth, and he went anyhow. And whether he was first or third or 50th, I don't care about that. But I will tell you that it took courage to get in that boat. And I think that's relevant for you because it took courage for you to get in this boat. For you to say, in spite of all the challenges we have, in spite of the fact that we're under-resourced, that we have high expectations that are probably unreasonable, that we're working in this environment where rhetoric rules the day, where it's not data that drives this. It's when can we do a press conference? God forbid Fluffy gets run over outside. We'll be at a press conference for Fluffy's Law being introduced, right? We live in this rhetoric thing where we have a margin of error that's this big. And the easy thing to do, where you're sitting, the easy thing to do is to do nothing. To just allow the status quo to rule the day. That would be the easy thing to do. And frankly, no one would blame you. So the fact that you have the courage to say it's not okay. It's not okay that in many communities we have kids who have an inevitability of an incarceration, who believe that's a normal part of their development. How is that okay? And every one of you sitting in the room said it's not okay. And what I challenge you to do is let's not feel the need to be defensive. Let's force them to be defensive. Defend this current system. In any debate I get on this issue, I love it because I just want to posture and to say, you defend this system. However you want to define it. You want to define it by recidivism, you want to define it by cost, you want to define it on impacts on the community. I don't care how you define it. You cannot defend an existing system if you're coming from a real place. And so part of that means that as you push reform, as you're doing these things that are just simply the right thing to do, it's really easy, and you put yourself in a position where you can get attacked. And let me tell you why. Because they can't attack what you're doing. So they're gonna attack you. If you can't attack the message, attack the messenger. So I hope every one of you are getting criticized for what you're doing. And I hope that you don't suffer from too much humility, that when you show these outcomes, you put it right back in their damn face. Because I think it's critical that we come from a place of strength and say, look, this isn't just gonna save us money, this isn't just gonna save lives. This is the right thing to do. This is what we expect out of our correction system to create an environment where someone can be corrected. And oh, by the way, we don't always have to use the criminal justice system. So I'll end with this, and then I'd be happy to take a handful of easy, simple questions. I prefer layups if possible. But I'll end like this. I think one of the reasons why we're at where we're at, and I became a county warden in 2002, so I've been at leadership in criminal justice for a long time. And since 2002, I can tell you that most of my conversations among my colleagues have been around individuals with mental illness. And the number still grows. And we've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And it's been an issue. And this approach that you're taking is similar to some other approaches that are going around the country that take these issues and problematize them. You see, you can't solve issues. Issues are just there. You can solve problems, but for something to solve a problem, you have to define it, you have to quantify it, you have to measure it. And then it just goes back to the old scientific method, right? Where we try stuff, we measure it. What works, we do. What doesn't work, we stop doing. That's called groundbreaking in criminal justice policy. Low bar, folks. Low bar. So let's lift that bar. Again, I'd be happy to answer some questions until my time runs out. All right, this is the awkward part. One brave soul leading us off. Thank you. Of course you are, but you weren't supposed to tell anybody that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I'm always, okay, yeah. So the question is, she said she heard that mass incarceration is largely driven by departments of corrections and probation and parole departments, violating people for rule violations as opposed to new crime, and in a disparate manner, more black and brown people. And I would say that's certainly part of it. Like, you cannot be in a room and have a discussion around criminal justice policy without race and poverty being the elephants in the room, right? And certainly when you quantify it, you deliver it down to that level, you will see disparate outcomes around parole violations. You'll see disparate outcomes around waiting time for treatment programs, even discipline within prison. So that's certainly part of it. I think one of the things that's really important, if we want to make progress, is that there's not one cause, that just like an individual, there's not one path to jail, right? There's not one path to prison. And there's not one, we don't expect one magic pill to solve every medical ill we have. So I think that's a piece of it. And I think that our policies, and I know Philadelphia is doing some work around this area. We really have to be aware of our response to violations. Again, putting people on a path to not violate again should be more than trying to get our pound of flesh and lock them up for a long period of time, when the research says that how long we lock them up is not predictive of whether they'll do better or not at the back end. Certainly a piece of it, and I don't think it's a whole ball of wax, but it's an area where we can make a lot of progress quickly, because largely it's controlled by internal policy as opposed to a requirement to legislate it. So thank you.
Can you give, how to hold this. Can you give an example of a data element that you looked at and something that you tried that worked? You know, how did you start when you took the job? What kind of data did you ask for, and what kind of grabbed your attention, and what was one of the first things that you tried, and then how did you see that, you know, when you looked at the outcomes, something that worked and you decided to stick with it?
Yeah, I didn't really get any outcomes. I just talk about this in theory. No, I'm just kidding. One of the areas is our halfway house system. We have a super well-resourced halfway house system. Where at the time I took over, we had 60 halfway houses. The outcomes were this. If an individual, when you match them across risk levels, an individual who went home through a halfway house had worse outcomes than people who went directly home. And this is what we call a good return on investment for $120 million spend, right? So what we did is we eliminated all the contracts, and we have both centers that are contracted and centers that are run by the state. Eliminate all those contracts and performance contracted the halfway houses. So we told our providers that we expect you to do A, B, and C, but at the end of the day, we're gonna pay you based on the outcomes of individuals who go through your center. So if you significantly reduce recidivism, like 2 standard deviations or 1 standard deviation from the mean, I just say that because it sounds smart. I don't know what it means. But my researcher said, so if you reduce it to that level, you'll get a bonus. If you keep it within the sweet spot, right, 1 standard deviation plus and minus, you'll continue to have a contract. If it drops below, you get 1 warning period in 6 months, and then I fire you. We were the first system in the country to do that. Took a bunch of political flack. The lobbyists all hit the Capitol, and a super Republican Capitol. And so I got called in a bunch of times, and I just said, wait a second, you're saying it's unfair to expect outcomes for a $120 million spend? So jump forward, we got some incremental reduction in recidivism from that approach. But the fact remains, we still get worse outcomes from sending people through halfway houses. So now the next iteration is cut the number of halfway houses in half, try to retarget to say that we know high-risk individuals do well going back through them, so we're gonna limit who goes back through them and see if we'll get further outcomes. If we don't, I'm gonna end all halfway houses in Pennsylvania. Because if we talk about being data-driven, that means that when something doesn't work, we have to have the guts to say, hey, this isn't working, and then end it. So thanks for that question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your words and your insights. It's been wonderful to hear the human piece of it as well as all the data collection, so I applaud you for that. You said that you reduced it by 1,000, the disparity of the minorities in your system. Wondering if there was one indicator that allowed you to do that. Was there one thing that you said this was the cause that we saw this increase in minorities within the system?
No, I think the vast majority of our policies historically just have disproportionately impacted that population, and things like mandatory minimums, like especially drug mandatories and school zones. Like in the city of Harrisburg, you could be standing in the state capitol and meet the criteria for being in a school zone, right? So those things disproportionately impact urban communities, right? So when mandatory minimums got thrown out, don't worry, they were reintroduced by the House Republicans who are gonna save us all. But when they got thrown out, that had a big impact. But also, we really focused on internal processes like how we schedule programs. So the number one reason, another piece of data we looked at, number one reason that someone got declined for parole is they didn't complete programming. So we looked at how we scheduled programming, and we just tried to re-engineer the programming so people were likely to complete programming by the time they came up for parole. So we used to say, when I'd walk around the system and say, how's your waiting list? Everybody would say the waiting list is good. What does that tell us? Nothing. So we quantified that to say that what percentage of our population has completed programming by the time they're eligible for a parole hearing. And again, when you look at, if you really drill down into systems, what you'll see is that racial disparity going throughout, even from the programming standpoint, disciplinary misconduct standpoint, which knocks someone off a waiting list. So when you start targeting these measures, you make system improvements, and system improvements, at least in my experience, almost across the board, disproportionately impact the people who are disproportionately negatively impacted on the front end. Yes, sir.
Is this on? As someone who has led a county jail system and now as a secretary of a state prison system, if you could identify just one or two things that would have been helpful or would be helpful now from mental health and substance use professionals to help you further reduce your population, what would those one or two things be?
Yeah, so I hate to do a commercial for another organization, but we're doing some stuff around this stepping up for mental health and really focusing on quantifying mental illness at the county level and forcing counties to define and quantify it in the same way. So Little Franklin County, maybe 140,000, 150,000 people, 300 people in the jail, and we couldn't even have a discussion with our human service folks where we were talking the same language. I mean, I would describe our meetings around this as like the Tower of Babel, right? Where we're saying, we have this many individuals with mental illness, and they're saying, no, well, we don't identify it like this, and we never took the next step as far as quantifying it. So I think the one thing that gives us the best shot around the behavioral health issue in particular is getting everybody in the room and forcing us to speak a common language. And in Pennsylvania, that started with the Secretary of Department of Human Services and I getting on the same page. And it was a pretty bumpy road to do that. He had just come in with the new administration. Governor Wolf, our new governor, couldn't find anybody dumb enough to take this job. So I stayed on. And one of the first things I did, I was doing an interview in the local TV on mental illness. And I made the statement that I always make: how does it make sense that I'm responsible for the provision of mental health care more so than the Secretary of Department of Human Services? What I learned is I should probably have a conversation with him to contextualize that first. So we later met at an adult establishment, and I thought we were going to do 6 paces and turn around. But it turns out that we really were at the same place. And so I no longer talk about institutionalization as a response to mental illness, be it institutionalization in prisons or institutionalization in mental health. He now understands my perspective, and so that relationship that we built led to us providing grant monies for a county to really start quantifying their mental illness with this proviso, and this is the coolest part of this. He's committed that if we can identify a gap in his system that leads people directly to jail, that he'll find a way to fill that gap. So from a behavioral health standpoint, I think that's it. And I think as I'm wrapping up here, I think the one thing that I'd really encourage you to do is not to waste this crisis of the opioid epidemic, as horrible as it is. For the first time since I've been in a job like this, I've been going around the Commonwealth with the governor who's doing these opioid roundtables. And I've heard law enforcement and Chamber of Commerce folks and people running hospitals saying, you know, these are our brothers and sisters, and we can't arrest our way out of this. And I agree with them wholeheartedly. I also agree with that same message with the vast majority of people who are sitting inside prisons today. So let's use this opportunity where finally them is becoming us. Let's use this to push some good policy. And I'm sure there's all kinds of theories, and people smarter than me can theorize why this opioid epidemic is different than the crack epidemic. But I got to tell you, if we waste this opportunity, it's really a waste, and we can really push good policy in this context of a notion where we actually humanize people coming through our system. Imagine that.